started.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paige Shelton. I am the Program and Communications Manager at the Institute on Ecosystems. Thank you all for coming in person today. It's great to have a big audience. Just a reminder for next week, we will be hearing from Daniel Anderson, who is the founder of the Common Ground Project. And Daniel will be speaking on how mature collaboratives might better serve nature and people in the G8. So I hope you all can come for that. It'll be here in Biker Auditorium. And I'll hand it over to Andy to introduce our speaker, Todd.
Welcome, everyone. Really great to see you. Hey, we're really fortunate to have Todd Wilkinson with us today. So Todd's is a correspondent with The Guardian and National Geographic. You might know that he collaborated with David Quammen on the National Geographic Year of Yellowstone work that was very widely read and highly cited. He's written several books with great titles: Science Under Siege, The Politician's War on Nature and Truth. That's a must-read, isn't it? Or how about The Last
Or a good
Stand?
fire starter.
Ted Turner's Quest to Save a Troubled Planet. Grizzlies of Pilgrim Creek, the intimate portrait of 399, the most famous bear of Greater Yellowstone. He founded the Mountain Journal, which you might know has become really the leading voice of science and conservation across the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This series, of course, of Rough Cuts is all about Greater Yellowstone. And some of the speakers are dealing with the drivers of the system, like climate change. Some are dealing with ecological response. Some are going to talk about specific conservation instruments. For example, conservation easements from Catherine Kelly in our last. When we invited Todd, we really had in mind more or less a capstone for the series, in that Todd's contribution is really pretty major. He's a visionary. He sees the big picture. He's a communicator. He educates all the rest of us on these topics. And he's intimately associated with policy perspectives. And so in that regard, I think you'll find his talk today to be illuminating and interesting. I'll let him share the title and sort of the logic behind it. So Todd, thanks so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to this.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and thanks to those who are tuned in. An Italian friend who's going to be watching this says that I don't smile enough when I give talks like this. It's probably my stern Scandinavian nature, so she's watching. Thank you, Paige. Let's give a round of applause for Paige, Andy, and Lisa. What I want to talk about today is really the intersection of everything that all of you are involved with. And if I can say one thing about an earlier book on scientific whistleblowers, Andy and I have spoken about this. One of the things that academia doesn't do very well is it doesn't prepare students for the real world of when you come in and you meet those ethical confrontations that really are moments of truth when you're presented with scenarios in which you feel like you have to fall on your sword and destroy yourself and your career, or you have to go along to get along. And those, we have lots of those in Greater Yellowstone. We have lots of those in the world today. And I want to talk about a moment of truth here in Greater Yellowstone. All of you are here because you love this place. I love this place. I care about this place. And we think about climate change, for example, as this big amorphous issue that's intimidating and overwhelming. It's hard to get our arms wrapped around. I'm going to be talking today about a very wicked problem. wicked problem that's hard to solve, but I think it is solvable. So here we are, October 26th, 2022. I want you to think about this. I want you to think about being here today, thinking about where we are in the ecosystem and where we are in the world. So the title is, Can We Save the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, the most wildlife-rich ecosystem in the lower 48, which corresponds with a book out that is a compilation of really 35 years of thinking about this place. I get to travel around the world quite a bit, but this is my home region. And 5 years ago, founded Mountain Journal to devote it to the Greater Yellowstone. Why is that? The first question I want to ask is, does wildlife matter? And this is going to be a tricky thing. So I want to see a show of hands with each of you. Raise your hand if you think wildlife matters. Excellent. You're caught right in my trap. Thank you. So here's some grizzly bears. These are bears that were nuisance animals that were sent to the St. Louis Zoo from Salish Kootenai country. So we think about grizzly bears. This is certainly one way to watch them. Kids love grizzly bears. If you want to see something magical, if you want to see biophilia in practice, go to a grizzly bear impoundment or the polar bear impoundment and watch these neurotic animals pace around in here. But you'll have kids of all nationalities, genders, races, and they'll stand in front of these enclosures and they'll just be smitten. There are no political divides or ideological divides there when they're standing in front of it, and it's really a lesson for us. But guess what? We get to see these animals in their wild state. This is Jackson Hole. This is a famous grizzly bear mother, 399, who's 26 years old. Looks like she may come out of her den next spring as a 27-year-old with cubs. That would match her as the oldest known female to produce cubs in the Greater Yellowstone region. She's produced 18 cubs, has a total of 30 offspring, half of which have died. And those offspring include cubs of cubs, which means she's a grandmother as well. But up here is Jackson Lake Lodge. And what 399 is doing is she's coming here in the springtime. The Tetons are over to the left. Jackson Lake Lodge is up here. And in the springtime, people will be up on the veranda of Jackson Lake Lodge watching grizzly bears stalk and eat elk calves. And 399 teaches them. And what's really cool in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and this is a shout out to half of the people in the world, i.e. the non-male folk, is that all of the learning in Greater Yellowstone among our wildlife is matrilineal. Knowledge is passed down. And she's been an incredibly adept mother. But again, wild country. It is a miracle that we have grizzly bears today, and I'll get to that in a minute. So, the question that you all answered, unanimous. This puts you in line with 4 in 5 Montanans who say that wildlife are an important part of their daily life, meaning they live here for this. They want to live here instead of taking their kids to go watch grizzly bears at the St. Louis Zoo. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. You see that. Would you agree or disagree with the following statement? Wildlife are an important part of my daily life. This luxury that we have, for those of you who are still students here and have come here to ski, there are a lot of places to ski and play. And I get it. The goal of putting in 100 days or making an excuse to not be in Andy Hansen's class and, I was really sick, but you're out getting powder at Bridger Bowl. I get it. Cool. But you're at a place, you could be at an Ivy League. And those students who are paying $60,000 a year in tuition, they don't get to have a front row seat to what you have. And so the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, here it is. Yellowstone National Park. Greater Yellowstone as a concept wouldn't exist if Yellowstone National Park didn't exist. And indeed, in the 1870s, politicians, local landowners, and industries were opposed to the creation of Yellowstone National Park. So if we had gone to a collaboration and consensus model, Yellowstone might not exist, or it would be a fraction of what it is. And even at this, we know that it's too small, that it doesn't support the incredible wildlife diversity here. And Grand Teton, same story in terms of local opposition and expanding it to its present boundaries. The first national forest in the country was here, in part to recognize that there needed to be an extension off the eastern side of Yellowstone National Park. And so we're public land rich. That's what sets us apart. And again, Bozeman, Montana, the capital city of the greater Yellowstone, is right in your backyard. And we get to look at it. But we get to do more than look at it. If we choose to, we can advocate for its persistence. So what sets greater Yellowstone apart? It's the only ecosystem left in the lower 48 that has all of its original megafauna that were here. When wolves were brought back, it offered completeness again. No other place, and I'll get to this, Glacier has, and the Northern Continental Divide has diversity, but what it doesn't have is it doesn't have all of these movements that are accommodated. And indeed, we also brought back trumpeter swans, which were pushed to the brink. And black-footed ferrets, the Lazarus syndrome, in which we had written them off as extinct. But black-footed ferrets were discovered when a ranch dog carried a ferret back outside of Meeteetse, and it was like, holy cow, these animals are still alive, and they were on remote prairie dog colonies. If you don't have prairie dogs, you don't have black-footed ferrets. And so these are all of the issues that can be really damned overwhelming. As a journalist, my world, when I started as a young writer, I was sort of gobsmacked by acronyms and laws, trying to articulate this stuff. It's really difficult to not feel overwhelmed. And indeed, I often feel overwhelmed trying to get my mind wrapped around this stuff. So I understand why you would too. But we need to all work through this. So what does this mean? How does it all come together? And the big question is, given all of this stuff, what is this place going to look like in 20 years? This is a question that I ask everybody who's in some sort of middle or senior management position, or whether you're a politician, or whether you're Andy Hansen. We spoke about this last night on the phone. What is this place going to look like? And I want you to just take 5 seconds. I want you to honestly think about this. Paige is from Colorado. In Colorado, they never thought 30, 40 years ago that the Front Range would be like the Front Range is today. They thought that laissez-faire market forces, that you would be able to have it all. You'd be able to have wildlife, you'd be able to have water, that it was Shangri-La. John Denver writes a song about it. You know, mountain town shifting to a recreation economy, away from resource extraction. We're where Colorado was 30 or 40 years ago, but we don't have the Colorado population yet, but we're getting there. And so again, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it is the only place like it in the lower 48. It is one of the only places like it in the world. In fact, people poo-poo the analogy of it being the American version of the Serengeti. And they say, look, I saw Lion King and I saw those wildebeest and zebra populations. We don't have all of them going en masse like you see there. but it still happens here. And it used to happen all across this continent. But one thing we need to do is we need to stop kidding ourselves and looking the other way. Climate change is easy to glance away from and just sort of resign ourselves and embrace adaptation and be defensive and reactive. And as all of you know, being matriculating at this great institution, being in constant defensive posture ends up with a lot of limited options, and they're very costly to try to fix if you make mistakes. So every talk that I give, I have this one. I like to think we aren't so much anti-science as we are pro-myth. Think about the mythology, the sort of tropes that we live our lives by that go unquestioned. That we are the greatest functional democracy in the world. That's one of them. Is that really true? So if we truly, sincerely, honestly are interested in saving this place, we have to debunk myths. We have to do it. It's really hard work. But if all of you are sincere when you raise your hand that wildlife matters, and this is the greatest concentration of wildlife between Canada and Mexico and the coasts, and what does that mean in terms of our personal responsibility? And the beauty of it is, and here's the trick part, that when you raised your hands and stated that as a value, you need now to decide whether you're going to be a hypocrite or whether you're going to actually act on that value. So myth number one, Greater Yellowstone is just like every other. We often treat Greater Yellowstone, particularly within a public land context, as, oh, there's just another Greater Yellowstone over the mountain range. The same way that we treat Big Sky and Bridger and Targhee and Jackson Hole as there's just more, it's just better places to ski, a little less crowded than Colorado. But if we treat it that way, we're going to end up losing something important. And this is what it is. This is just the elk migration map put together by the Wyoming Migration Initiative. Really great stuff. And it's an example of, only until recently, it's like the invention of a microscope, being able to see microorganisms where before we didn't understand that they even existed. But with radio collars and technology, we knew before that animals moved. We didn't know how or why or the importance of that movement. And in fact, indigenous people understood this, and their lifeways were adapted to this. Ancient migration routes, as old as our river systems, and we're at the headwaters of three great river systems. The great Upper Green, Colorado, as you all know, Glen Canyon Dam is losing all of its water. A myth that we would have water forever and we could turn the desert into a green botanical Garden of Eden. But one of the things that's really interesting here is that every species migrates. I didn't know this until Chuck Peterson told me about spotted frogs, but some spotted frog populations will migrate miles. And talking about charismatic megafauna, we have about a dozen elk herds that spool into Yellowstone. Think of it as a bicycle with spokes coming into the center. And they follow the green wave in springtime up to the high Yellowstone plateau where they calve and forage. And as you all know, you're more informed than most people in Bozeman, Montana, or the world, that in addition to this just phenomenon on the landscape and the fact that it can happen because of an intact landscapes without a labyrinth of obstacles, that what's really cool is these things are all transporters of energy. This is an electrical system. And what it is ungulates eat grass, conversion of energy from sunlight, and they put on biomass and they transport this around the ecosystem, and it supports predators and scavengers, and their herbivory is what has fine-tuned grassland systems. If they don't show up, it's like bees and pollinating plants. It's really important, and this exists for mule deer. So mule deer, we have one of the longest migrations from west side of the winds. A mule deer traveled all the way up to Island Park, Idaho, and back again. And that mule deer was radio collared, so we knew that, but it did it twice. So imagine a commute of 500 miles across roads and barbed wire fences and via hunters and predators and through Jackson Hole, but that mule deer came up and went like this and went back again. That doesn't exist anywhere else. Pronghorn that spend their summers in Grand Teton National Park, and if they don't get out of there now with winter approaching, their survival rate plunges because they're stuck in this high elevation area, and yet they gather all the way down here. So pronghorn, mule deer, a lot of oil and gas exploration has happened here, and it had a huge impact on migration routes. And so we have elk, we have pronghorn, we have mule deer, grizzly bears migrate, wolves migrate, bison migrated. 12,000 bison have been killed migrating into Montana based on the false premise that they're going to spread brucellosis. And if you say, oh, that there's a journalist going off half-cocked, yeah. Google the report from the National Academy of Sciences that said the probability of brucellosis being transmitted from Yellowstone bison to cattle was like 0.00 something. Question: what animal we're talking about wildlife diseases, epizoonotic diseases, what animal represents the highest probability of transmitting brucellosis to cattle?
Oh, no.
Exactly. But we haven't shot 12,000 elk pouring out of Yellowstone at the border. Why is that? Anyway, migration, it's a really cool thing, and this belongs to all of us as part of our legacy. And again, this is a bison photograph taken by winter keeper Stephen Fuller. 23 wild bison left in Yellowstone, augmented by other animals. Fortunately, they didn't have introgression by cattle genes, and so we have this genetically pure herd, sacred survivors to indigenous people. They should be sacred to us, but just 23 survivors. I want you to just think again for 5 seconds. Imagine that you were in Bozeman in 1890 and you had the wherewithal to realize that there were 30 million bison 80 years before you. And we brought them down to 23 animals in Yellowstone, and there were poachers in the upper Yellowstone Valley that wanted to kill them because market value, supply and demand, and when things become rare, their value goes up until we kill them off. The Lacey Act was born in Yellowstone. An Iowa senator wanted to prosecute a poacher who was going in and would have killed every last bison in Yellowstone. Market forces at work, laissez-faire, free market forces, no government regulation. In the absence of government regulation, we wouldn't have bison today. But here's what's really cool and makes the story even. It's not that these animals all persisted in large numbers. It's that through conservation efforts, people who came before us and stood up, what we have is we're able to bring these animals back. They persisted here at low animals, and we brought them back. We rewilded Greater Yellowstone. We are the primo example in the world of rewilding, right here. The rest of the world is watching us. The challenge for us today is, on our watch and our generations gathered here, are we going to be remembered as the generation that had this abundance? Did we let it slip away? Did we let it become a little less de-wilded, or do we de-wild? And if we de-wild this place, it's going to be permanent, and we'll get to that in a second. So myth, the federal land base is sufficient enough to protect wildlife. Hear this all the time. Oh, if we just, protect our federal lands, it's going to be cool. We're in the clear. Federal lands, Mississippi River. Why isn't there a greater Yellowstone ecosystem like east of the Mississippi? Think about that. It's self-evident. So when we condemn the West and public lands, and we think about greater Yellowstone and our view from Bozeman, Montana, is it an asset or a liability? We fled Europe, the Europeans who arrived here to escape aristocracies and large single landowners where we couldn't have access. And as a Minnesotan, I love the West because of the access, but over time, I really love the West because of wildlife. And so we don't have greater Yellowstones here, and we don't have another greater Yellowstone here. Maybe here, indeed, but we don't have another one in all of this. And we don't have most of this here. So we think, and the conservation community, I once had a sabbatical with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. I wrote their first communications plan. And in those days, in the early 1990s, the focus and what we hear often is that if we just stop massive clear cuts on public land, and if we just stop mines on public land, this is Butte, and if we just control livestock on public land, and if this is oil and gas, remember I mentioned mule deer? Imagine mule deer having to go through this, and imagine the stress levels on those mothers that ultimately affect fecundity and reproduction, and that's key. So if we only get it right on public lands, that we're going to be in the clear, at least that is the assumption. This is private land. This is a subdivision not far from here. How is this more innocuous than that? So to return, 23, 24 million acres in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that would cover most of New England. We have all this stuff happening on the landscape. 6 million acres determines the fate ultimately of the other 18 million acres. So if we don't get it right on public land or on private land, we can't get it right on public land. Again, think about those movements. All of those animal movements, for example, Paradise Valley, they cross, they come off the plateau, and they go to Winter Range. They come out of the Gallatin Range, Winter Range in the Madison. They come out here south of Island Park. The National Elk Refuge that's held up as this paragon of conservation over conserving elk, that is the poster child, the mother of all examples for what happens when you plug a wildlife migration route. Elk refuge is right there. Elk used to migrate just as those pronghorn and mule deer out of Jackson Hole, but they're stranded now. And in order to keep those populations up, the assumption is that we have to artificially feed them. And so we feed them, and we know that now the population of the elk refuge is over objective by a large amount. And guess what? In Grand Teton National Park, remember, we feed elk here, produces too many. And in Grand Teton National Park, the only national park with a large big game hunt in the lower 48 called an elk reduction hunt, we hunt elk there because we're producing too many there. Think about the discontinuity in this ecosystem. So, another myth, all growth is good. and we'll grow our way to a better ecosystem. Ms. Tollison, is that true? Does that happen on the Front Range of Colorado?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. That wasn't a rhetorical question. Thank you for your answer. We have a great cartoonist at Mojo. Can you all see this? This is where we are today. It's a spoof. It's a Gary Larson-like approach. But think about it. Everybody who's been moving here during COVID and prior, I'm someone who moved here. It's all better than where we came from. And if we live in the suburbs and the exurbs before we came here, our suburbs and exurbs seem really wild compared to those suburbs and exurbs. But is that sustainable? Next myth, growth just happens to us and there's nothing we can do about it. Just roll over and take it. That kind of contradicts the notion that Homo sapiens, the sapiens part of our species. We are a thinking species. Stuff just doesn't happen to us. Most of what happens in the world is created by us. The question is, for problems that we create, do the answers reside in using the same kind of thinking that created the problems? Can we get our way out of the problems? So this is Bozeman, Spanish Peaks, Gallatin Range, Bridgers up here, Shangri-La to a lot of people are moving here. Bozeman, Montana right now is the fastest growing micropolitan city, small city in the country. It's the it city. We're all here with our hipster friends taking advantage of Bozeman. I'll tell you, I like Bozeman a lot more than I did when I first moved here a long time ago. But that doesn't mean we don't have choices. And one thing, when I moved to Bozeman, out here, between the town and between the Gallatin Range, there used to be at least 1,000, maybe more elk that you would see. They'd wander right up to the edge of the town here. You remember that, Mr. Hansen? This is another reason why Andy Hansen is an important thinker here, because he's bringing attention to all of this fragmentation. But what does it mean? So here's the growth rate in terms of human numbers in Greater Yellowstone. Here's the growth rate in Bozeman. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's complicated. Park County, Montana, if you go to Livingston, people will say, oh, the population hasn't grown that much. What's the worry? The number of homes on the landscape has increased by double the amount of newcomers coming in. Why is that? Does anybody know?
Trophy homes.
Exactly. So people come in, retirees, they come in and they build their trophy homes. They live there only part of the year. They sit unoccupied, but the footprint is there. Footprint never goes away. You can, on a ranch, you can adjust cattle. As long as the land base is there, you can do things. But when you have subdivisions, you can't, right? So Brent Brock, who's with Future West and is a great independent researcher, what is this Rorschach test? What it is that all of this stuff is roads, trails, all sorts of incursions in southwest Montana that when an animal comes out of Yellowstone, which doesn't have many roads, it comes into here. So Bozeman's here, or Paradise Valley, Bozeman's up here, Madison Valley. So there's this assumption that animals just roam across these open spaces uninhibited. But imagine if We made our living by our hooves and our mouths and our fangs. And imagine if we had to run this gauntlet all the time. So how do we save this if animals have to deal with this? This is exurban and suburban development beyond the cities. How do we do this? So in 2017, when Mojo was formed, the first long-form piece that I did was on growth. And the reason is that more than anything else, more imminent right now than climate change is our footprint. Because our footprint is going to determine whether we can save this place. So right now, at a conservative rate, within a generation, we're going to be Salt Lake City sized. We're going to grow from about 120,000 people in Bozeman-Galton Valley to 240,000. It's not the entire front range of the Wasatch. Salt Lake proper, good sized city, 240,000 people. We're going to reach this within a generation. In fact, in 2017, that projection that we do it in a generation, things have accelerated during COVID. Randy Carpenter, who worked for Future West, said given recent census data, within the next 10 to 12 years, there are going to be 60,000 people added to Bozeman, the Galton Valley, and Big Sky, cumulative. That means a population greater than the current size of Bozeman proper. And then if we double again, and we have effects, COVID's great because it's kind of an indicator of climate change in a way. It's a perturbation elsewhere in other urban populations. So as the Southwest runs out of water, as coastal areas are dealing with storms and that kind of disruption, as wildfires hit California and people have said they have enough, it doesn't take a lot of people to cause a huge disruption here with our footprint. So by the middle of this century, we had about 2065. We're going to be Minneapolis proper size, which is about 440,000 people. What does this place look like? So Livingston to Gardner becomes Bozeman sized with sprawl, Ennis to Big Sky. If things spill out the back end into the Madison Valley, becomes Jackson Hole size. What happens when we have all these people? So this was the lead graphic, and people were, ha, 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 you're exaggerating. Well, guess what? We actually undershot the projections. Not that it's going to turn like this, the Minneapolis skyline, but in terms of the population projections, it's serious. And we use the rule of 72. You divide a growth rate into 72, and you get the number of years that it will take to double. You can do that with your financial investments too. So take the percentage of interest, divide it into 72, and you're going to find out how long it'll take your money to double. Same thing with population. So conservatively, if the growth rate of this was in 2017, if the growth rate of the past 30 years continues, population in the greater Yellowstone region is expected to surge in just 13 years' time. So 5 years ago, ecosystem-wide, 100,000 homes. It's not people, that's homes. So you look at 1.5 as the most conservative to say 3 or 4 dwellers per house. It's a lot of people out there. A lot of people going into that 6 million acres of land. And FYI, we're undergoing one of the most rapid transmissions in the history of our region from agrarian lands to exurban development. Ranchers and farmers are imperiled species. So again, how does this change the way we think about this? So I give a lot of talks on the southern end of the ecosystem. One of the things I said down there in 2018, I was talking about Salt Lake City proper size population, and people poo-pooed that, and they said, oh, we'll never get like that. I said, well, consider this. If you do a tic-tac-toe from Idaho Falls to Rexburg, and that wasn't even including Island Park, and you do this, 2017, the total population equals Salt Lake City proper in 2017. Salt Lake population. You go there today and it's sort of like, what's the problem? A lot of spillover happening from Jackson into Teton Valley, Rexburg, with Idaho State, BYU exploding there. The question is, what happens when all of this infills? This, by the way, is the southern extension of the High Divide ecosystem, which connects to Greater Yellowstone, goes up into the Idaho wilderness. And as you all know, Greater Yellowstone, hopefully there will be connectivity north to the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. We talk in glowing terms that that's going to happen. But the question is, how does that change everything on the southern part of the ecosystem? Remember, Salt Lake City is down here. That's our major population center. And if you go to the Wind River Reservation or the Wind River Mountains today, you'll drive for a dozen miles down dirt roads to trailheads, and they'll be dominated by Utah plates. So we in Bozeman think of Salt Lake being so far away. People on the southern side of the ecosystem are feeling this pressure because this is the playground for Utahns. So myth, if we only close our eyes, everything is going to be all right if we do nothing. So we think about this, we don't want to make hard choices. This may be the hardest choice of all. It's doing nothing. And that's really what we're doing right now. This is why all of you are important, really important. Myth, we can have it all if only. This is what having it all looks like. This is multiple use, folks. Multiple use crafted in an earlier time when there was a lot more land and a lot less people and a lot less ecological awareness. Trophy homes. We can have golf courses in the mountains. We can continue to log. Recreation can come online. We can have roads and snowmobile. But on this game, what happens to these guys? You think about intactness. Can they exist on a checkerboard? I don't even need to answer that question for you. So if only we speak using magic words like stakeholders and shared spaces and balance. Show of hands, how many of you have heard these words in thinking about the rhetoric of the conservation world? Raise your hand if you've seen these words. Right? They sound good, don't they? We're all going to get along. What does stakeholder and shared spaces and balance mean? This is what it means for humans. What does it mean for these guys? This is a great photo, by the way, by Holly Pipple, who lives out near Gallatin Gateway, and she is documenting visually the destruction of the great Gallatin elk herd that's been famous for over a century. So think about language, the language we use. The thing that strikes me ever more is it's so homocentric. And you think about the country, so it's like, well, are you excluding humans? No, in fact, we've done a pretty good job of not excluding human beings in the lower 48. One of the places, the reason why we have Greater Yellowstone is because there aren't more of us. So I just want you to think about that proportionality of human needs and interests and desires versus those of wildlife that have no other place to go. Greater Yellowstone is abundant as it seems it's the only island like it left. Balance, stakeholders, shared use. How well is this going to go for the moms that calf there in the Southern Gallatin Valley? We live in a time in which we talk about monetizing and commodifying nature. Everything is for sale. We're building an economy on natural amenities. But we don't think about the value of it, the intrinsic value, the non-amenity, non-monetary value of nature. You know, should we have to put a value on the fact that you can step out of here and head to the national forest and feel peace and comfort, which is great for your mental health? How do you put a value on some of these things? All of these reasons why people are coming here, we're all consumers. So 3 reasons newcomers are moving to Montana. Look at these. So people from rural areas and metro micro areas to find a desirable natural environment with better access to the outdoors so we can play, to find a less congested place to live, to take advantage of a slower pace of life. Look, I recreate. You all recreate. If we had a list of 100 things of recreational pursuits, most of us would check most of those boxes. I would, including motorized. One of the best moments in my life during my teenage years was getting my snowmobile permit so I could drive my snowmobile to outdoor hockey practice in Minnesota. So I've been a motorized user. So everybody's coming here for the good life, and indeed, this is nirvana compared to places where people are fleeing. And they're coming here and they have no problem with this. This looks pretty good. You can have your ranchette. But I'll tell you this, one of the biggest hurdles that we face is ecological illiteracy. It sounds wonky, but we're not aware. We're just not aware. It's not that most people have evil intent. A piece that I'm posting at Mountain Journal soon talks about the soap opera Yellowstone. Think about the clashes that are going on there. There's some evil intent written into that script. But here's the contrast. A majority of Montanans say that quality of life has gotten worse in the last 5 years. Near majorities of virtually every subgroup say it has declined. So for all the people who are moving here, it's nirvana. But for those of us who are from here and watching the decline, and then we get disparaged as being NIMBYs, like you just want to shut the door. Yeah, we do want to shut the door if we want to have wildlife, but we can't shut the door. Change and growth are inevitable. But does it just have to run its own course, or can we shape it? So some of this stuff, some of this data, remember, came out of Montana State University. It's doing really great work to catch the pulse of what people are thinking. So think about this. This is something that's really interesting. So lack of affordable housing. Desperate people do desperate things. We've got to take care of people. I mean, think about the inequity of creating a great place and then local people not being able to live there, or kids not being able to come home. I mean, it's obvious. It's kind of a duh, right? And Bozeman, Jackson Hole, Big Sky, most of the mountain towns up and down the Rockies have a huge affordable housing crisis, and the market ain't going to fix it. It's going to require government intervention. It's going to require government subsidies, but we live in a state, in a region where people hate government, so we're kind of in a place where we're not going to fix it. But here's so the lack of affordable housing, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute. When we talk about this, development sprawling on ranches, changing character, crowding and more people at places recreate. So we think about habitat for people, habitat for humanity. What about this? So extremely and very serious or total serious concern. So 3/4 of the people in Montana realize that we're squandering our habitat. We're displacing people and we're displacing wildlife in this age of prosperity. What kind of prosperity destroys the environment? The kind of prosperity that exists in Butte, Montana. Home to the largest Superfund site in America, linear. Yet we still live by the myth. I want you to think about this. We go out for our mental health to recreate and we feel good. And it's interesting when a term that I see often now is people, downhill skiers and cross-country skiers and trail runners, climbers, referring to themselves as outdoor athletes. It's a great thing when we think about, but what are we competing against when we're out running by ourselves or with friends? What are we doing? We're competing against nature, it turns out. We feel good, it improves our mental health, but what do you think it does to the mental health of the animals we're displacing? Think about that. But we hear this trope all the time, recreation is conservation. And my question is, how exactly does that work? You live here, pretend this is our home, and pretend that we have everything we need here, and 3 times as many people come into us and disrupt our ability to eat and sleep. How does bringing more people into a finite space to play where wildlife live and have nowhere else to go, how does that benefit wildlife in a tangible way? If you have the answer, I'd like to hear it, because I haven't seen something that explains that riddle. Dudes, I discovered this secret wilderness spot. Tons of wildlife, fishing is epic. Posting pics on Facebook now. What do you think happens to those places when that happens? Is this a spoof or is it real? Conservation, as generally referenced, is not necessarily wildlife conservation. So think about the term conservation, the word. Think about the term and word sustainability. What does that mean? What are we sustaining? This is something that, as a journalist, that I see every day. I see that term and I think about, because once you start thinking about it, you can't go back and unthink it. That's the problem. It's the problem of all of you being here at MSU. Once you know this stuff, you can't unthink it. So, Gallatin Valley Land Trust, great land protection agency, love the work they do. They work on a volunteer basis of willing landowners entering into easements. And as a result of this, the hospital is right over here. We come here in the wintertime and we ski, we hike, we walk our dogs. But when you look at this space, do you think of it as great wildlife habitat? Maybe for white-tailed deer. I mentioned to a colleague the other day that I was flying out of Bozeman on assignment, and I heard some people saying, there's so much wildlife in Bozeman, there's abundance. We see all these white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are the weediest of species out there. They can live anywhere, like coyotes and raccoons and skunks. And just because you have white-tailed deer on a golf course or running through here doesn't mean that it's a biodiversity that's up to the caliber of Greater Yellowstone. Myth, our elected officials, land managers, and enviros are doing enough. If that were true, would we have problems? Can we use a mentality that existed post-World War II to the end of the last century? Can we resolve the problems that we've created with the thinking that's gone on today? And do we have enough time to wait for people to get it right, or do we need to act with urgency? So as a landscape fills in, how much time do we have before it becomes moot? And then we don't have to worry about wildlife anymore. So Paradise Valley. You know, if you go out into a subdivision in Bozeman, you'll see roads like Elk Avenue and Grizzly Bear Lane that commemorate the animals that used to live there. The question is Paradise Valley, is that same moniker going to be almost a mockery of place? In Paradise Valley today, stretching north from Yellowstone up past Livingston, the Shields Valley, there are more than 5,000 lots that have been subdivided of various sizes and approved at the Park County Courthouse that have yet to be developed. So what we see here today is a mirage. And guess what? People in Park County, the elected officials, some of the land managers, some good conservation-minded folk believe that what happened in Gallatin Valley isn't going to happen there, just as Gallatin Valley thought that what has happened there happened in Colorado would never happen here. There's no zoning with teeth there, just as there's no zoning with teeth except for local communities that have come together and in sufficient number embrace zoning. So this is what's happened. We were in a state of denial in this valley too. This is going on right now. So Headwaters Economics, they do great work. And some of the federal agencies, they do great work as well. And not long ago, there was a statistic talking about 93,440 acres lost in Gallatin County alone in the last couple decades. This was before COVID, by the way. But what it doesn't, it's deceptive because it does not speak to how many more acres, likely several times that number, becoming impaired for wildlife function, meaning animal movement is being negatively affected and eventually will result in animals being extirpated of their presence and untolerated. So Andy Hansen a few years ago did a study that looked at what happens when you disrupt natural landscape, what happens to bird populations. So not only do native species go away, but you get invasives that come in and outcompete them. That's happening in the mammal world. It's happening in a lot of places. And so the human footprint, there's a statistic that was done by Chuck Schwartz, and I'll get to this in a minute. He said that if you have one development on a section of land, 360 acres, grizzly bear will avoid that space. Grizzly bears are indicator species. So is this the kind of open space we're going to have? Is this what we're going to mean by wild country? How much value does that have for critters? So grizzly bears, success story. Look at the expansion of grizzly bears. It's great, isn't it? We think that we have grizzly bears coming out of our gills. Here's some other stats. So 82% for grizzly bear cubs of the year. So survival rate for grizzly bear cubs of the year outside of Yellowstone in the recovery area is 82%. Outside of the recovery area, it's 10%. So yearlings that manage to survive and get through that year, 92% for yearlings, it drops to 35% outside the recovery zone. It's a tough world. Grizzly 399 going through the subdivision of Jackson Hole. Earlier this year, one of her cubs was killed running into people. Subdivisions are landmines. Myth, apathy is an acceptable excuse. So by now, a lot of us would be feeling depressed, right? Okay, what are we going to do? We're overwhelmed. I like to think that our challenge is to be mirthful warriors and not accept what we don't want to accept. Myth, the biggest of all, that you don't matter. You all matter in a big way. So can we save Greater Yellowstone, the most wildlife-rich ecosystem in the lower 48? There's good news. Yes, if hold on, greatest concentration of original, full, intact biodiversity left in the lower 48, the Paragon. It's what the American Prairie Reserve is spending hundreds of millions of dollars hoping to build a reserve of 3.2 million acres and bring prairie species back. It's going to take decades. What we have here is what they aspire to become again. Our job is, what's in our hands now is, don't mess it up. Especially this. This drives the ecosystem as much as the watersheds for every species. Elk in the Gallatin Valley. So I want you to imagine that we're 20 years into the future. I will be 80 years old in that future. Imagine that we've all reconvened here. Do we want to be asking the question, did wildlife matter in 2022? Do we want to leave any doubt in people's minds? Did we really engage, or did we do it in a half-hearted way? Because right now it's half-hearted. We define our life here by what we want to take and what we want to have, not by what we're willing to give up. So I'd be grateful if you all would read Mountain Journal. By the way, Joe, if you'd stand up for a second, right there. This is Joe O'Connor, our new managing editor.
Hey, how are you?
If any of you want to write for Mountain Journal, he's the guy to reach out to. So the question is, this is what I get all the time. You do a great job of laying out what the challenges are. Okay. We want to get serious. Let's do it. So number one, we will not save this place without an ecosystem-wide vision grant strategy that includes all of the federal and state agencies, all of the 20 counties, all of the towns, the business community, the conservation community, proposing a strategy that unites and thinks beyond boundaries. We're not going to do it. It won't happen piecemeal. Two, we need to map all wildlife migration routes, and that's going to mean what's really cool for you who are interested in biological science, putting collars on a lot more animals that tell us where they want to go and what they need. Zoning in the county. So migration routes tell us what we need to protect and where we can build. In the state of Wyoming right now, the most divisive political state arguably in the country, where even Republicans are arguing with each other, where Liz Cheney can't be reelected as a Republican. They all agree on wildlife migrations. Wyoming is doing a great job, and Montana is failing in our ability to map wildlife migrations. We need urban growth boundaries. What is that? That means hard lines of where pastoral and wild nature begins and where development ends. This is over just east of the tobacco roots. We need to heed this. Yep. Real estate transfer tax. In the ecosystem, $5 to $6 billion of real estate has changed hands since COVID. If we had a real estate consumption tax, which is what it is, every time one buys a property, a big property, they pay maybe a 1% tax. So those who buy and can afford to buy property can afford to pay taxes. This would go back to incentivize easements, to pay landowners so that they can stay in business, to tolerate predators. The amount of money with just a modest tax on this, we could create a war chest for affordable housing so that all of you in the room could have a place to live here. A lot of places have real estate transfer taxes, a backpack tax. Hunters and anglers pay for ammo and they pay for guns and they pay for other things, and that has supported a lot of habitat protection in the country. So, why isn't there a backpack tax? The reason is that at the end of the Clinton administration, there was an act called CARA that would have implemented a backpack tax on all outdoor gear beyond hunting and fishing. Guess what? The outdoor retail industry opposed that. They say they already pay enough in tariffs and other fees. But we are consumers. This notion of consumptive versus non-consumptive, when we're bounding down a trail or we're going off trail and we're displacing wildlife, again, to get into the language of how animals see things, an animal doesn't differentiate between consumptive and non-consumptive. If a mother has to flee with her offspring, that could create a lot of money for habitat protection. It could also incentivize the states, the non-game divisions, to protect and manage for biodiversity beyond just game species. We need real courage from elected officials, agencies, conservation groups, business people, media, and enlightened citizens. And if I may say something at the risk of heresy here, and I don't mean to insult my host here, but this applies to colleges and universities. A few years ago, I got invited to be a part of this sort of focus group that was looking at dubbing MSU the University of Yellowstone. Show of hands, how many of you have heard of that? The university retreated because it was deemed too controversial. So MSU is out there promoting students to come and recreate at MSU. They're not doing a very good job touting the fact that you live and study on the edge of the greatest ecosystem in the lower 48. Some of you in your lives are going to spend thousands of dollars going to see the Serengeti, and you have an American version of it. Every year, nature tourism in Yellowstone and Grand Teton alone, most of it tiered to wildlife watching, $1.5 billion if we don't mess it up. Dispersed recreation, this includes the agencies. Dispersing more of us into spaces that are, quote, unused. It's like saying your living room is unused, so let's move, let's rent out spaces in your living room. Professional ecologists on staff of every county and city. For those of you who have degrees, it'd be great. We need science. Growth should pay for itself. We're subsidizing destruction in many ways. Numerous studies. Some people, this isn't my term, have compared growth to a Ponzi scheme where you keep approving growth to pay for the growth previously that doesn't pay for itself, to generate revenue. Diversity, equity, inclusion applied to people and humans. Some people say a speciesist argument is very controversial, but for animals in an ecosystem like this that have no place else to go, why aren't we thinking about protecting biodiversity? Why aren't we thinking about the equity that animals need, the fairness when we talk about sharing and balance, and inclusion? When we talk about stakeholder groups, I don't see grizzly bears having their seat at the table and wolves. Instead, we tend to cluster all wildlife into this thing. We generically refer to it as wildlife. But why does that happen when each individual stakeholder group with recreation gets its own seat at the table? Why is that? Animals exist. These are bighorns in Yellowstone. It's tough for them out there, and they don't have a lot of places to go. The terrain is tough. I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. 10, we need to reject anti-science, alternative facts, and elect smart people. I mean, we can't give people ecological literacy tests, but we can elect people that we know are smart and literate, and that is the only way we're going to save this place. So, please read Mountain Journal if you can. It's free. We're nonprofit. We're like NPR or PBS. We're devoted to Greater Yellowstone, but I hope you'll check it out. So I've gone over my time, but I really appreciate you indulging me today. So thank you. Any quick questions? I love questions.
I think there's a raised hand on Zoom.
Yeah. Lots of thank you.
Well, I'd just like to say, Todd, I don't have a question, but this is your best ever presentation. I mean, and I've listened to you speak many times, and this is it. This, I wish we could give this over and over to this community.
I thank you. What I want to say is that we're all here together. This is really our issue.
I agree.
And, this is not a partisan issue. These divides are not, wildlife is not partisan. Again, we need to sort of recapture that energy that exists with kids whose first wildlife encounter is at a zoo. We have the wild thing here. So, but I'm grateful. Thank you.
What can we do as individuals?
So that, the standard answer is, well, we just give more to conservation groups. You should be asking conservation groups where they are. And the first question I would say, look, I love conservation groups, obviously. They're my friends. They're doing great work, often thankless work. But we need to hold them to account. Two things. One, they need to be promoting a vision and pressuring the agencies to get involved, or we're going to lose this place. That's not me jumping on a soapbox. We're going to lose it. We know what happened in Colorado. We know where we're headed. The second thing is they need to be involved in county planning and zoning. We need to get beyond the point of where we can't say the Z word, zoning. Voluntary zoning doesn't work. Rational self-interest doesn't work in holding things together. So what can we do? We need to spread the word and get this going. The unfortunate thing is most of us have been silent. We're very passionate. We're alarmed by what's happening in these places that we love. The people tuning in are coming here and they fly into Bozeman year after year and they see the change that's happening here. It's obvious. So the big thing that we need to do is become aware and encourage our friends to become aware and take pride in the fact, recreation is great. But with that passion that we get for the outdoors, we need to be thinking of how we can give back in incremental ways. I wish I had a playbook for doing it, but the first two things are we need a vision and we need zoning, because if we don't get it right on private land, doesn't matter. Our public lands are going to be degraded. So, but great question. Thank you. Does that make sense?
Todd, can I plug Gallup Wildlife?
Please.
All right. Right now, the Forest Service has a project out called the South Plateau of Vegetation Treatment. It goes from West Woodland. It borders Yellowstone on the east, the south, and the west are the Continental Divide. And I could show you a map of what?
We'll do that. One thing, because we don't
Yeah.
have a lot of time,
Oh.
could you tell everyone the website that they can go get your
Yeah.
information? That's best for
Good.
people listening.
And I will take your email if you want to give it to me, and I'll send you what we're working on. Okay. GallatinWildlife.org.
GallatinWildlife.org if you want to hear more information about the work that they're doing. They are tenacious. by
And
the
if
way.
you want to see what the South Plateau looks like, I got it here, and I'm going to leave it with you, Todd.
Okay, thank you. And you can also reach out to Paige. She can provide anybody who's listening in with contact info.
How do you see the role of landscape architects, urban designers, and architects That's
Great question. So traditionally, landscape architecture has taken a urban, suburban approach to things. And that's because that's where the thinking is on most people. Are you a landscape architect?
yes.
You're at the front end because the most important decision that we make as it relates to land is where we live and where we put our house. You are really important. It's not just about compatibility. It's not Frank Lloyd Wright building into a waterfall, right? It's about pulling back. It's about not dominating winter range. It's about, you really need to help. And this is crucial. I have a lot of very good friends who are involved with this discussion right now. And we can appreciate the view without owning it, right? We can love wildlife without taking its habitat. And so you and the architecture school here play a really important role. And this is one that you can actually play a nationally significant role in. We need to have a lot more discussions and generate more energy in the room with what you're doing, because if we get that wrong, so the public or private land thing is so important, but that is at the bullseye, at the heart of what we need to be doing on that. And anyway, that is a great question. My simple answer is you're at the center of all of this, because the built environment is going to determine whether we save this place or not. So thank you.
So maybe just one or two more questions. We'll close it down after that. Paige, do we have the online
We have
questions?
2 online. So Sandy, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. Todd, we had a candidate forum here last night. I wish everybody had seen this before they came to the candidate forum, but they didn't. So my question for you is, can we access this, or everybody actually, Paige, can we access this program?
Yeah, absolutely. It will be on the montanaioe.org website, and I can post a link in the chat on the WebEx for you to see that. It's recorded, and I'll have it posted probably by the end of today.
Thank you.
You bet.
I want to make a shout out to Sandy Shuptrine. I moved west as a violent crime reporter from Chicago to Jackson Hole in the mid-1980s. Sandy Shuptrine was fighting off a landfill in important wildlife habitat in Jackson Hole. And she was very gentle to this young greenhorn reporter. She became a county commissioner, and she is one of those admirable citizens out there who has shown there's no retirement age from making a difference. So Sandy, you know, I honor you, and I honor all of my friends in Jackson Hole. And so thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, Kathy, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey Todd, this was a great presentation, so thank you. And I enjoyed reading your new book a lot. And in the book, I was really kind of overwhelmed by the chronic wasting disease issue that you cover in several chapters. And I wondered if you would comment on that as like a serious and immediate threat, and how you think it relates to development and climate change.
Absolutely. So before I begin, I want to do another shout out to my friend Kathy Whitlock, who is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the most prestigious scientific body in the world, the one who's leading the way in the United States and a player in climate change discussion. She is among a handful of people in our part of the world who's a guru on climate change, started as a field researcher, has done delivered a couple of excellent reports on climate change related to impacts on agriculture and natural resource industries, human health, and most recently on Greater Yellowstone. So, Kathy, as you know, chronic wasting disease it's an emerging issue. It's a fairly emerging epizootic issue. The problem with CWD is, and it's one that relates to all infectious diseases, is that when we group bunch up organisms together in an area of high infectivity, we have high infection rates, and then in an ecosystem like this, it spreads in ungulates. So chronic wasting disease is a disease that affects members of the deer family: elk, mule deer, white-tailed deer, and moose. And because we have such prolific movements, there's so much stuff. If you get a chance, please pick up ripple effects. But the answer is that we've got to get a handle in addressing the source of the problem first, which is you don't make the problem any worse, right? So feeding animals at high densities in Wyoming, where they do it on 23 different areas, is a huge problem. But it gets really scary. So far, we haven't had a spillover incident into humans. But the real issue is what happens when that becomes inevitable. Michael Osterholm, the foremost authority in the country, says we won't be able to control the hysteria when that happens. And it has implications because these agents, non-organic things called prions, they're a protein, when they get into the environment, they don't degrade, and they're shed into the environment through urine and feces, and when animals die, and then they can be taken up and infect other elk and mule deer and whitetails and moose. And so the real danger is what happens if these animals become a liability on private lands and ranchers start worrying about prion infection on their pasture land. And we're not talking about this, and we need to. And one thing related to this, because I could go on for a long time, what we know from scientists is that prions have not only do they stay in the soil forever and create zones of contamination, but there's been an uptake in things like alfalfa, corn, soybeans, commodities that are traded. So what happens if we have prion infection in commodity crops that are shipped? How do you test for that? How do you impose bans on that? How do you overcome the trade ban that gets into this? And it's something that it's a source problem that we think about in sort of a micro level, but it has huge macro implications. And CWD is this ecosystem problem that's spreading. And moreover, we haven't had spillover effects into other mammals like the predator guild, but we know from great research that having a healthy predator guild, by that I mean wolves, grizzly bears, coyotes, and mountain lions. Mountain lions are ambush predators. Wolves are coursing predators. Different ways, but they're very effective at identifying sick animals and taking them out of the population. Thank God they don't catch chronic wasting disease. But what I would say is that we're killing our very allies and controlling them that are far better than we are in being able to discern if they're sick animals. So my hope here is that Kathy Whitlock and Andy Hansen and others will take this on as a priority because it's urgently needed. But thank you. Great question. And before I let you off, give us the web link of where they can read your reports on climate change.
You can go to the IOE website, and there's 3 reports now. So go to montanaioe.org, where you got onto this seminar series too.
Great, thank you.
Todd,
Thanks.
you certainly did a fantastic job. Let's thank Todd for that great job. And, if any of you want to talk one-on-one, he might still have some time to chat with you, and we can recess as a group.
Thank you for
Thanks to all
coming.
of you online as well.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.